My story is a bit long and complex and kind of unbelievable. It's sort of very odd, but there are other lectures that I've done that you can look up that get more into detail. But yes, I'm a senior software engineer and platform architect. And what happened was, I began this journey in 2015 when following surprisingly high cholesterol levels on a keto diet. Like all of a sudden, at 6, 7 months in, I found that my cholesterol has jumped through the roof. And that's when I became obsessed with lipidology and lipid metabolism. And I have frequent N of 1 experiments in biohacking, some of which we'll be getting into here. I think at last count, I was at around 52 N of 1 experiments of various time spans. So here's the lipid energy model in a nutshell. This is a bit simplified. We literally are working on a paper that we're very excited about that's going to be in publication soon, but this is super high level. So to approach it, you need to understand something important, which is that many going on a low carb diet observe their cholesterol levels rise, just as I mentioned that happened with me. And through a series of experiments, myself and many others have helped find connections between metabolic changes and cholesterol levels. I have and continue to hypothesize these cholesterol levels are highly influenced by the trafficking of fat around the body in lipoproteins. And again, we'll unpack a lot of that in just a moment. So I like this analogy a lot. What can this bag teach us about fat storage? Well, what if you couldn't open or close this bag? But what if you could break the balls apart to small enough pieces to get through the mesh holes? Well, if you could understand this concept, you can kind of get a sense of how fat storage works. So this is triglycerides. This is the storage form of fat-based fuel. It's commonly found in adipocytes and lipoproteins, but this big bulky molecule stays well within membranes. So kind of like the balls that I just showed you in the mesh bags, they're big, they're bulky, they hold. Now, with the help of an enzyme, we can hydrolyze them out. What we're doing is we're breaking them into their two major components. The two major components are one, glycerol, which is a 3-carbon chain that connects the fatty acids together. This is why it's triglycerides, because it's 3. And it's very soluble in the bloodstream. And by the way, it's commonly used by the liver to generate glucose, a process known as gluconeogenesis. And then there's free fatty acids. They're also known as non-esterified fatty acids, or NEFAs, right? And this free form of fat-based fuel is commonly found in the bloodstream, often carried by a very prominent protein known as albumin. And this small molecule can easily slip through membranes. And this part is super crucial. So what you're having this constant converting back and forth between these two categories of things. You're having this re-esterifying of things into these triglyceride, these big bulky molecules that are being stored inside of membranes. And then they're getting broken out into the glycerol and free fatty acid constituent components when leaving membranes. That's a very important part of this story in the model overall. So now we go very top level. We've got body fat on the left. We've got the liver on the right. We have tissues in need, like oxidative tissues. So when healthy and becoming low carb and fat adapted, which is going to matter not just for keto, but also for fasting, right? We hypothesize the following. You have a higher continual release of free fatty acids from adipocytes. You're able to see my mouse okay here, right? Are you able to see that all right? When I do this?
Yes.
I may have to move it like really fast to get there. So you have a higher continual release of free fatty acids from adipocytes, and that's good because they can get to tissues in need. They can make use of these free fatty acids in the blood. But you also have a higher uptake of free fatty acids by the liver. So some of these constituent components are also being taken up by the liver, and that's good because now you can have a higher liver production of ketone bodies, the process known as ketogenesis. And there we get ketones. And Yay, this is not controversial. You guys probably already knew this. It's exciting. We love to talk about the keto diet because the term keto is just so sexy and tantalizing, right? And the whole process of being, making ketones, it's great. But the irony is that that's actually just one component of what is otherwise really probably more accurately called a fatty acid diet, not just a ketone diet. So with this top part not being controversial, let's talk about the bottom part. What we hypothesize is that there's a higher re-esterification of triglycerides in the liver. So they're being reassembled back to that storage form of fat. And there's now a higher secretion of these triglycerides on board lipoproteins. Lipoproteins is basically short for lipid carrying proteins. So they're like boats. These boats that have this membrane, which we'll get into in a moment, have these triglycerides on board. And now with this higher secretion of triglycerides on board lipoproteins, we have a greater direct supply of VLDL to both adipose and non-adipose tissues. So getting back to the tissues in need, they have three major arrows now, not just the free fatty acids being released by the body fat, and not just ketones, but also direct supply of triglycerides on board these VLDL particles, but also back to the body fat. Body fat can also be repleted of those fatty acids and also re-esterify these triglycerides in-house. Okay, and this results, and this is an important part here, because up till this point in time, you probably heard that going on a ketogenic diet means that, wait a sec, your triglycerides go down. Why would we not be seeing higher triglycerides in the blood if this is part of the model? Well, we also posit that there is a much higher turnover of VLDL in delivering these triglycerides to tissues. And here's the money shot. This can then result in higher final LDL particles and thus higher cholesterol detected on the LDL particles. Basically, what you're seeing is a lot of boats that have already delivered their cargo, but because there needs to be more trafficking, there are more boats. All right, this is controversial. This whole bottom half is basically my research in a nutshell. And it's actually what I just told you right now at the highest level is actually very difficult to get across to even some of the highest level medical professionals. Even though as an engineer, and to a lot of my fellow engineers, this kind of makes sense because we're used to working with networks and we're used to working with dynamic rates of turnover. It's often assumed that there's not, or at least it's not intuitive that there are dynamic rates of turnover, but I absolutely contend that there are. Okay, so let's zoom in on body fat in particular, because if you look at the literature, it's really only been in like the last 10, 15 years, which is like a very small amount of time in medicine, that body fat has been getting the level of attention it deserves, because it definitely deserves a lot. So let's look at body fat and cell membranes. This is adipose tissue, right? And of course, the cells themselves are known as adipocytes. And the anatomy of adipocyte is kind of fascinating because unlike other cells, its nucleus is kind of hugged up to one end, and its mitochondria is over here, but it has this gigantic fat reserve with triglycerides, this lipid droplet. And now let's look at the bilayer that's not just part of adipocytes, but it's a part of all cells. It's got lots of different things on it, including a lot of transport proteins and many other things we're not going to talk about now. But what we're really interested in is its main constituent components with what is known as the phospholipid bilayer. All right, phospholipids are kind of cool if you really look into them. They have this hydrophilic head, which means it's water loving. Hydro is water, philic is love. And so it'll point towards the aqueous environment. And then it has hydrophobic tails, water hating, right? Or water avoiding as its legs. That's the other part of it. So what's neat is if you could throw a whole bunch of phospholipids into a solution, that's, a water-based solution, and they will form this bilayer. The heads will point out and the tails will point towards each other, and they'll create this bilayer. It's pretty cool, but it's also extremely unstable in many respects because it's a bit too fluid. And that's where cholesterol comes in. Cholesterol is the component that's part of the stitching of this phospholipid bilayer that actually gives it just the right amount of stiffness and give. And there's really a lot of interesting biochemistry that goes into that. Well, okay. So with that in mind, here's our anatomy of a cell. A cell bilayer does have it with the blood on the outside, it's water-based. Its cytoplasm is also water-based. So it has this bilayer. It has these phosphoheads pointing in either direction. But then you have this other one that I've been mentioning a lot, these lipid-carrying proteins known as lipoproteins. And it is ready to go into an aqueous environment like the blood because it can solubilize in it, but it can have this lipid core. Its cargo can be lipid-based. And this is important because while I'm not going to go into it in this lecture, while I'm mainly going to be talking about triglyceride transport and cholesterol, your body has all kinds of lipids it needs to get to all the cells. And I'm not just talking about energy, and I'm not talking about just cholesterol. I'm talking also fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. The body in its genius makes this just one giant boat, this lipoprotein, particularly ApoB containing lipoproteins. And they can all ride share in getting into these lipoproteins and then making it out to cells. This is the stock photo of a lipoprotein. And yeah, we have a chunk cut off here so that we can kind of see that lipophilic center. And yeah, that's a lipid core. The phospholipids and the free cholesterol is here on the outside. And so with that in mind, this gets a bit more complex, but you know a lot of these elements right now, which is, again, lipid bilayer is here for the cell, right? Because the cells are much bigger than these lipoproteins. Outside the cell is the bloodstream, inside is the cytoplasm, and this is the lipoprotein. In this case, it's a chylomicron. It's gigantic. Chylomicrons come from your gut. You just had some food. They're huge. They're bloated with triglycerides, almost, the most triglyceride rich of the lipoproteins. And they're now needing to supply those fatty acids around in circulation. So how does the cell connect to them? Well, they connect to them because it's got these apolipoproteins or apoproteins, just kind of like think of Velcro, right? One end of this is made to connect to this other end, which is a receptor. Cells have a huge family of receptors, lots of different types, but this receptor is pretty important because it'll attach to this apolipoprotein and activate a process known as hydrolysis. It's hydrolysizing, which getting back to the beginning of the lecture, it's breaking apart those triglycerides and then getting them through the cell membrane. Okay. So we're going to focus on three specific categories that I've just now talked about. The triglycerides, which are also effectively the glycerol and the free fatty acids, the phospholipids, and the cholesterol. And before I go any further, because we're focusing just on that, I'm not going to talk a lot about the other proteins that are involved and many other elements that are part of these frameworks that we'll be discussing. So bear that in mind. So if hydrolysis provides these lipids, then as the lipoprotein releases lipid cargo and it gets smaller, how does it get smaller? Is it that it just shrinks? Does the monolayer, tighten its gaps between the phospholipids and the cholesterol? No, that doesn't happen. As you learn about, physics and chemistry and so forth, they're not going to squish tighter together. What has to happen is this monolayer releases phospholipids and cholesterol in order to remodel to a smaller size. This is crucial for you to understand. It's crucial for you to understand that these membranes, in order for them to get smaller, they have to shed. In order for them to get larger, they have to take on. It's a very important part of this model and really part of biochemistry overall. So when this lipoprotein is docked to this adipocyte, and I do want to specify adipocyte, the fat cell, if this needs to shrink from releasing lipids, the lipoprotein, this needs to grow to take them into storage. Seems fairly intuitive, right? Well, fortunately, there's this other part of the process, which is called lipoprotein endocytosis, endo being inside, right? And by completely taking up the lipoprotein, the cell can incorporate its phospholipids and cholesterol to the bilayer. That's handy. Thus, we're not just growing the contents of the container, we're growing the container itself. Think about it. It's actually pretty cool. You've got these lipoproteins that are moving around. And if you don't just want the contents, if a cell wants to actually take on its exterior as well, then endocytosis makes perfect sense. And it's why we have receptors that accomplish that very goal. So now let's talk about a very important enzyme called lipoprotein lipase and the very famous HDL, which you usually hear about as relates to the quote unquote good cholesterol. So this paper is like really important to me, and it's actually very old. I'm actually lifting some of the text from its original copy. This is from September of 1978, 45 years ago. And I posit this was one of the most powerful clues, not just to our model, but really, I think, to a lot of current and chronic disease. So what they did was, this was an in vitro study. An in vitro study is, it's outside the body. This is the formation of high density lipoprotein 2-like particles during lipolysis of very low density lipoproteins in vitro. And you're probably going to get a little bit lost on this. Don't worry, I'm going to take it up and digest it for you in a moment. So HDL, this is another kind of lipoprotein, HDL, and it's much smaller. It can be divided into at least 2 subfractions. HDL2, right, which is this one over here, and it's the larger size. You see alpha 1, alpha 2 over here. And HDL3, which is, by the way, a bit smaller, right? And this is like the very small nascent type, A4. And what they did was they put these together, and they found that substantial hydrolysis, again, hydrolysis being the release of those free fatty acids, of over 80% of VLDL triglyceride occurred during the 4-hour incubation with, I'm going to hide this for a second, something magical, for which then approximately 45% of both VLDL protein and phospholipid and 15 to 20% of the VLDL cholesterol disappeared during lipolysis. So what was that? What was it that actually shrunk it down? It's lipoprotein lipase, the addition of this enzyme. Meanwhile, substantial changes also occurred in the HDL3 population that was a part of this same solution. And HDL3, the smaller type, concomitant with the lipolysis of VLDL during that same 4-hour incubation, without the enzyme, no changes happened to the HDL3 species. But when lipase was present, the HDL3 disappeared completely, and at the end of the incubation was replaced by the less dense lipoprotein, which exhibited the flotation characteristics of HDL2. Okay, so look, what it is simply this. What we're seeing is, when you leave these and add nothing, you still have large VLDLs, the triglyceride-rich ApoB containing lipoproteins, the VLDLs I mentioned earlier that are supplying tissues and remodel to LDLs. And you have this other species, these small HDL3 species, which is basically how they start. VLDLs start big and get small. HDLs start small and get big. How? Well, actually, this in vitro study was showing one clear, obvious way in which it's done. You add this lipase, you add lipoprotein lipase, and 3 things happen. It's important to know this. These 3 things. The VLDLs got smaller, but why? Because they were not only just hydrolyzing out their cargo of these free fatty acids and glycerol, they were also releasing their surface area components, those phospholipids and free cholesterol, to these acceptor lipoproteins, the HDL. So you can think of ApoB containing lipoproteins, and particularly VLDL, as a constant provider of lipids, not just of the triglycerides and glycerol, but also of their surface components to the HDL species. These are the acceptors, providers, acceptors. Okay. Now let's get to the specificity of that use of that enzyme. So adipose tissue lipoprotein lipase activity is high in fed animals and low when animals are fasted. But most studies have shown that the opposite is true in the heart and skeletal muscle. So this 2x2 grid shows something very important. It shows that in the fed state with these animals, their adipose tissue, their fat cells, they have a higher lipoprotein lipase activity. Makes sense. Their fat cells are taking up more of those triglycerides for storage. Meanwhile, their heart and skeletal muscle actually down-regulate. They inhibit lipoprotein lipase activity. Also makes sense. You're feeding yourself right now. So a lot of those things that would have taken work and effort to package together, you can just make use of right now with your oxidative tissues. However, in the fasted state, well, now it's different. Now we're not in storage mode. Now we're in release mode. So lipoprotein lipase at the adipocytes goes down. Makes sense. Why would your fat cells want to rob your oxidative tissues of those triglycerides on those lipoproteins? Meanwhile, it's the reverse for heart and skeletal muscle. Lipoprotein lipase activity goes up, right? So LPL and adipose, this is, by the way, from one of my favorite reviews, which is down here, it's linked below. In mature adipocytes or adipose tissue, insulin not only increases the level of lipoprotein lipase, mRNA, which gets us into genomics, by the way, but also regulates lipoprotein lipase activity through both post-transcriptional and post-translational mechanisms. And get this, glucose also increases adipose tissue lipoprotein lipase activity. One of my favorite things that came out of this review is that it also talked about lipoprotein lipase in the heart. The heart is a major site of lipoprotein lipase synthesis, and fatty acids provide over 70% of the energy needs for cardiac muscle. Not surprisingly, cardiac muscle is the tissue with the greatest expression of lipoprotein lipase. And thus, lipoprotein lipase is likely to be an important enzyme in cardiac lipid uptake and metabolism. In summary, the results from rodent models of altered expression of lipoprotein lipase in heart emphasize the important role of cardiac lipoprotein lipase and triglyceride-rich lipoprotein metabolism. Neither non-esterified fatty acids, the free fatty acids that I was just talking about, nor the compensatory increase in cardiac glucose metabolism can entirely replace fatty acids not provided by lipoprotein lipase in the heart. Okay, let me summarize this for you. In other words, the heart doesn't just need a lot of power to be powered, given how, impressive it is as a muscle. It cannot get enough just from the free fatty acids and just from the glucose. It literally does want a higher degree of triglycerides off lipoproteins. Why? Because of course it's a massive source of fuel. These are like tankers full of energy relative to the smaller bits of glucose and free fatty acids that are moving around. Okay, so getting us back to the membranes again. So you've got the ApoB lipoprotein, except now we're going to go ahead and add the high density lipoprotein in this case, right? Again, think about this in terms of membranes, think about this in terms of contents. And we're going to bring back the adipocyte. All right. So if lipoprotein lipase activity is increased at adipocytes, assuming under healthy conditions and all else being equal, and this is, by the way, a lot of fine print, we should generally see the following. This is going to be a list. Bear with me for a moment. Greater uptake of triglycerides from these ApoB-containing lipoproteins like chylomicrons and VLDL. Higher turnover of VLDL triglycerides means more VLDL phospholipids and cholesterol transferred to the HDL species, right? More of those surface components. Remodeling of VLDL to LDL, right? So these are going to get transferred more to the LDL side. And greater growth of adipocytes requires more endocytosis of lipoproteins like LDL. In other words, these adipocytes, in order to grow, are literally going to be taking up more of the LDL species directly. All right. So if lipoprotein lipase activity is increased, what can we expect to see? So adipocytes should get larger. Triglyceride residence in the bloodstream should drop. Tests for ApoB lipoproteins should show less triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. More ApoB lipoproteins should be endocytosed. Thus, tests for LDL particles should actually show less in total. An LPL turnover should move more cholesterol and phospholipids from ApoB lipoproteins to HDL lipoproteins. I know I said a lot there. Bear with me. I'm gonna come back to it in just a second. But we could flip the script. We could flip the script and see if we would see the same in reverse, because all of this would make sense in the reverse. If instead you're fasting, if you're releasing, then adipocytes should get smaller. Triglyceride residence in the bloodstream should increase, at least temporarily. Tests for ApoB lipoproteins should show more triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. Less ApoB lipoproteins should be endocytosed. Thus, tests for LDL particles should show more in total. Less lipoprotein lipase turnover should move less cholesterol and phospholipids from the ApoBs to the HDL lipoproteins, and thus HDL species should be smaller as well. All right, so here's the cool thing. Got an unusual data advantage. Our many experiments have given us a special insight on lipid dynamics in a large variety of circumstances. And we now have a constant flow of data from the cholesterolcode.com submissions, Facebook groups. Both CC and lean mass hyperresponders are over 12,000 combined, and various contact via email and direct messaging. And yes, I've got a lot of experimental data, a lot that I've done in particular directly. So here's where the meat gets really nutrient dense. Sorry, I'm going to be rolling through a lot of data real quick, but it's important. This is literally what I started out my very first lecture at Breckenridge with. And what you're looking at is a 3-day average of dietary fat. That's this dotted orange line and this axis on the left versus LDL-C cholesterol, as in the test taken after the 3 days of what I tracked. And as you can see, this is the original LDL inversion. This is an extremely tight inverse pattern. So the more dietary fat I'm consuming, the lower my LDL cholesterol, and vice versa. The less dietary fat I'm consuming, the higher my LDL cholesterol. Well, in retrospect, since advancements in the model and what I just talked to you about now, I definitely believe that my adipose lipoprotein lipase activity is being increased when I'm consuming all of this fat. I'm eating lots and lots of fat. I believe my LDL-C is going down because more of these ApoB lipoproteins should be endocytosed. Thus, tests for LDL should show less LDL-P and LDL-C, which is what they show. Same thing with 3-day average of dietary fat versus HDL-C. HDL cholesterol is tracking positively with this, right? So adipose lipoprotein lipase activity, whoops, let me go back. We're seeing as I'm going up here, I'm consuming lots and lots of fat. LPL turnover should move more cholesterol and phospholipids to the HDL lipoproteins. Thus, HDL species should get larger as well. Okay. And I had this experiment. This is in 2017. I talked to a whole bunch of people into doing the Feldman protocol. And sure enough, when we got tested on Friday of 7/14/2017, everyone then, along with myself, just consumed huge amounts of fat, including dietary fat, including saturated fat. And if saturated fat increases your cholesterol, presumably this would be a direct test of that. Instead, what we saw was that 19 had a decrease of their LDL cholesterol from between 5 to 38%, whereas only just 3 had an increase of 1 to 2%. So you can see each of these are a colored line of where they started to where they ended up. And I like to call it the broken ladder because almost all of them trend down, right? This is my weight gain experiment, which I did in 2018, May and April of 2018. And you can see my LDL-C, which is the blue line, versus green, which is my body weight. And the axes, as you can see as it comes this way, you can see at the peak of my weight, I was 204.5 pounds. At the nadir in this set was 199.2. And my LDL-C, my LDL cholesterol was 133, right about the same time. And its peak was 228 milligrams per deciliter. And to really put this in perspective, we're going to invert the LDL-C And you can see just how closely it tracks with my weight inversely. And for the geeks, let's go ahead and not only throw up the Pearson, just as a negative 0.936, let's also show a scatter plot, which is an R2 of 0.8481. I don't know. What do you think? You think my LDL-C tracks with my weight inversely? I think this is extremely strong data. And again, this is just because I'm an obsessive engineer. So I'm willing to literally get my blood taken like every single day. There's a whole lot of great data that came out of this experiment, by the way. But this is one of the most exhaustive experiments, and they're twins, which is great. It's a replication experiment. I've done this twice, and they were a year and a half apart from each other, but they were both identical. So this is a bit busy, I know, but basically here's the gist of it. I had a maintenance phase that was 5 days long. I had a hypocaloric phase that's low calories, literally half of the food that I had in the maintenance phase for another 5 days following. And then lastly, I had a hypercaloric, which is a high calorie for 5 days. So again, stating it one more time, these were experiments that were exactly 15 days long. One was in the spring of, I believe, 2019, and the other was in the fall of 2020. And they both had not only these 5 days of exactly the same meals, but they were taken at exactly the same times. And everything else was controlled. It was meant to be as identical as it could be between both of them. So let's first look at body weight. Not too surprising. If you look at this first column, this is the date of the last experiment. This is what phases they were of the 3 phases. And this is the weight of version 1 and the weight of version 2. All of the next several charts will follow this format. So the blue line is weight in version 1, as in the spring of 2019. And the orange line is the spring of 2020, where I started at a little bit closer to my normal body weight at 192. And not surprisingly, when I went hypocaloric, it was going down. When I went hypercaloric, it was going up. Okay, so what happened to my other metrics? Well, my glucose, not too surprising, pretty much stayed level up until I went hypocaloric, started dipping down. I go hypercaloric, it starts going back up again. Beta hydroxybutyrate, the very famous ketone body, which you can get through like Keto Mojo, which is how I was tracking mine. It was baseline around here, started going up as I went hypocaloric, which wasn't too surprising. It's kind of cool. You also sort of see this adjustment phase. And then as I went hypercaloric, starts going down. Also not too surprising. LDL-C cholesterol follows the inversion pattern, though it's a bit noisier. Here's the baseline. Hypocaloric starts kind of going up. Hypercaloric starts going down with both experiments. HDL cholesterol tracks the other direction. Baseline, it starts going down. Hypercaloric, consuming a lot, starts going up. Triglycerides starts going up during the hypocaloric, and even has this huge spike right as I'm switching over to the hypercaloric. That one's a little bit of a geekier section that I left out of this talk, but I would argue that it actually comes back to a slight delay in the transcription and translation, which Lucia may want to chat about, knowing her area of expertise. So what do I think is happening during that spike? Well, from a systemic standpoint, we're seeing going from that one point, going from hypocaloric to hypercaloric, going from low calories to high calories. I believe that the small intestine, I'm bringing in a whole lot of chylomicrons, but bear in mind that I have a whole configuration, systemic configuration, that's currently in a hypocaloric state, right? So I'm already in a process of releasing. So we have this higher reesterification of triglycerides coming out. My insulin is going up, my leptin is going up, my lipolysis, my release of free fatty acids is going down, but it's not instantaneous. For a period of time, there's energy competition during this state of change from release to storage. So if you look at my numbers, they seem to reflect exactly that. We've got glucose, right? It hardly changes. But look at the beta hydroxybutyrate. see where this line is? We're talking about the changeover of that line. This blood work was taken on day 2 of the high calorie diet, day 2. And we see that it spikes up. And it's the same thing with triglycerides. Triglycerides, again, the storage form of fat inside lipoproteins, are at their peak on the morning following 24 hours at the high consumption of dietary fat, but it almost instantly changes and then starts dropping, right? Okay, now let's look at the replication experiment data on the phase completion. Again, each of these phases were 5 days long, and then I took wide spectrum blood work that goes above and beyond just my lipids. So, unsurprisingly, as I just mentioned, my insulin, my leptin, and my free T3 at stable when I was just maintenance level, they're right around here, but they all start to go down as I'm in releasing mode. I'm releasing energy from my fat stores. But then as I go into storing mode, insulin, leptin, free T3, they all go up, right? The glucose, triglycerides, and free fatty acids, we can see they pretty much track as we would expect. Free fatty acids, I tapped directly. And triglycerides, we can also see, sure enough, they do follow. Now, again, in the releasing mode, triglycerides are up because we're not talking about the actual secretion of the triglycerides. We're talking about the turnover, especially at adipocytes. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Non-HDL versus HDL cholesterol. During the releasing phase, my HDL cholesterol is going down, while my non-HDL cholesterol is going up. And it goes conversely during the storing phase when I'm hypercaloric. Then lastly, ApoB. ApoB containing lipoproteins, especially VLDL, LDL. They're going up during the releasing. And ApoA1, which is attached to HDL, is going down. These are all things that if you end up rewatching this, all link back to the things I was hypothesizing as they relate to lipoprotein lipase from before. So here's one of my favorite things. I was also getting Boston Heart assays at the same time, and they have a cholesterol balance assay that proved very powerful in looking at the model. Lathosterol and desmosterol are markers for cholesterol synthesis. So they're indicators as to how much you're making cholesterol in the body. And for me, we see during my maintenance phase, my total cholesterol is going up. This was reflected from earlier in the presentation, and is going down during the hypocaloric phase, right? My cholesterol is going up. Is it that I'm making more cholesterol? And then now I've like dropped down on production of cholesterol? No. Lathosterol and desmosterol, actually during the maintenance phase, we see that they both go down. They're going down during the hypocaloric phase, even though my cholesterol and my LDL cholesterol and my ApoB, they're all at higher levels during this hypocaloric phase. Yet my synthesis, my creation of cholesterol in the body is going down. And then they go up during the hypercaloric, even though my total cholesterol, my LDL cholesterol, my ApoB, they're all going down while I'm making more cholesterol. So in spite of total and LDL cholesterol detected in the bloodstream, production of cholesterol has increased substantially, presumably to meet trafficking and tissue demands. So I did love that I also got the Boston Heart HDL map. I'm sure you remember this from earlier, right? Here are the different species. A2 and A1 are part of the HDL2 species. And so we can see this right here. We can see in the maintenance versus hypocaloric versus hypercaloric, these species. In the hypocaloric, we see this decreased adipose LPL activity. Look at that. My total number of A3 types, they go up, as does my A4. So these are now higher. In fact, they're the highest of the whole experiment, right? And meanwhile, my A1 and my A2, they go down, suggesting less conversion. But in the hypercaloric phase, it looks like I'm making more and bigger HDL particles, and that there's less of those that we're going to find in the HDL2 category, right? So that's why I wanted to return back to this, and that's why I'm going to slow it way down, because if you remember anything from this, remember, engineers, we like systems. We do not like looking at a single marker and then from that deriving a whole lot of conclusions. On the contrary, we like profiles. We like complex things that we put together at once. You tell me your car makes a loud sound. That doesn't tell us much. We want to get under the hood, right? So going back to that experiment, we know that when we add nothing to these large VLDLs and these nascent HDLs, we get no change. And this is outside the body. Yet we add outside the body lipoprotein lipase, inducing this activity, and we get these three results. We get hydrolysis of the VLDLs, these triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. We see these components, and also, and importantly, we see these surface components of these VLDL getting moved over to the HDL species. And there's a lot of great work by Anatol Kontouche, who we're working with on the Lipid Energy Model, who gets into even deeper detail if you want to get deeper into that rabbit hole. So let me ask you, what does this profile look like? What do we see when we're looking at this? We see large VLDL, we see high levels of triglycerides, and we see low levels of HDL species with low levels of HDL cholesterol. This looks a lot like metabolic syndrome. That's why I believe this experiment from like 4.5 decades ago held a huge clue into what would then be called Syndrome X and has now been renamed to metabolic syndrome. What does this look like? Well, to me, this looks like something you guys may not know that much about, or maybe some of you do, which I like to call lean mass hyperresponders. And we have a whole paper on this. And this emergent phenotype often has super high levels of LDL cholesterol, super high HDL cholesterol, and low triglycerides. This is the graphic that I posted at the time in 2017 and wrote about it. And I didn't actually even realize how much many of these things would turn out to have some traction. On a low carb diet, if you're very lean, you have lower glycogen stores as induced by low carb diet. And if you have lower body fat, and if you're athletic, well, then lipoproteins may be needed to traffic a greater amount of energy from fat, resulting in higher LDL cholesterol markers. So you end up with this profile, not just one thing changing, three things changing. Your LDL cholesterol goes up. Really, technically, your total and LDL cholesterol goes up. Your HDL cholesterol goes up as well. Your triglycerides go down. Now, going back to the thing I showed you from before, and the reason I really want to tie this up is, what do I think is happening? Well, I think that there's more VLDLs moving around in somebody who's very lean and athletic to meet existing demands, especially when there's lower adipose mass, less fat cells, right? So there's more of a need to do the trafficking. So more of this LDL is really downstream of higher turnover of those VLDLs, just doing so much more delivery. And the higher HDL is the huge clue. The higher HDL is the result of the turnover. It's suggestive as this universal acceptor of these lipids from the ApoB that that's what's happening. And alongside the lower triglycerides, it makes it make much more sense. It's why those two, why the reverse of those, having, say, low HDL and high triglycerides, is associated with something known as atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is a huge cardiovascular disease risk. Okay, just want to do a quick acknowledgement. All members and patrons to Cholesterol Code, of course, and all contributors to the Citizen Science Foundation. I haven't had a chance to go into all of the studies and work that we're doing right now, but I did kind of want to keep this brief. I'm not sure if I succeeded in keeping it brief, though. I always try to fit in too much. And of course, my good friend and colleague, Siobhan Huggins, and my also good friend and collaborator, Nick Norwitz. We've got some amazing work out. We've also released papers on lean mass hyperresponders. You can probably look at us now. So thanks again. And by the way, if this describes anybody who is watching this right now, if you have high LDL cholesterol, high HDL cholesterol, low triglycerides, please check our page, because we're doing a study on lean mass hyperresponders. Go to citizensciencefoundation.org/study. I hope you don't mind if I fit in that last plug, because we haven't yet hit our recruitment goals, but we're very close, where we're actually getting CT angiograms, and we're going to be able to turn around data on the risk itself. So that's my talk. All right.